right, so before I continue on, I have a question. How many of you, bad smells freak you out? Bad smells, bad odors gross you out. Like more so than the average person maybe. Like you smell something bad, you might vomit on demand. Whether the smell is something like rotten eggs or somebody's fart or, vomit itself, right? It's vomit inducing, right? Smells, maybe me just talking about nasty smells already triggers that in you a little bit. And for that, I'm sorry. But the reality is smells are not a pleasing thing. It's not an aroma that we particularly want to be around. I'll never forget one time I went to open my fridge and something terrible happened in that fridge between the last time I opened the fridge and that time that I opened the fridge. And I thought, holy cow, something's bad. And so, I began looking around for it, and, the smell was so overpowering, I couldn't smell any of the nice leftovers that were in there. I couldn't smell anything except for the bad smell. And after, moving things around, looking around there, opening the fruit drawer and sticking my hand to move it around, and my hand was wet, I pulled my hand out to have like a moldy, fuzzy piece of fruit on my finger. Lo and behold, that was the culprit of said smell. And it was terrible. And you guys, can you relate? Like, maybe it's not like that dramatic, but like you smell something, it's like you cannot move on. You cannot think about anything else. Your mental space is clouded until that smell disappears, right? It's something that I think is wired in all of us. It's pretty disgusting. And in this series, we've been talking about the fruit of the Spirit, about how to have the good life by emulating Christ within us and having His Spirit live in us and move us and guide us. And the reality is that you've met somebody who does not exude the fruit of the Spirit in their own life. In fact, people that smell rotten, not because of their hygiene, but because of the way that they treat other people, the way that they treat you, the way that they just are. They're not fun to be around, right? In this series, we've been talking from Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 through 23, which talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control, gentleness is in there. So if that's the good fruit of the Spirit, then pretty much opposite of that is all the bad fruit. And we've been talking about this the last 4 weeks. This is our last week in this series. And the reality is we have to address the bad fruit in the room. Because you can't really move on. You can't really get past the bad smell. There can be like chocolate chip cookies in the oven and like scented candles that like smell really good. But if there's something rotten, it overpowers all of that, right? And many of you know people that when they enter the room, they overpower everybody else because of just the lack of good fruit. And so we have to address it. We have to talk through that. And sometimes we gotta smell ourselves. Now, don't smell yourselves, because some of you are just out there in the 80-degree weather playing Ultimate Frisbee, and I'm sure you don't smell fantastic right now, but you get the point that I'm making. I'm sorry for the bad joke. But the reality is that all of us recognize this truth, right? Bad fruit is easier to smell than good fruit. And so in our lives, we've got to figure out what it is that we are supposed to do in order to not only be the good fruit ourselves, but also to not focus so hard on the bad fruit. Because we've just established that bad fruit overpowers good fruit. But the reality is most of us, we don't have to look far in our world before we see the bad fruit. We don't have to look far because we're bombarded with the news and messages and social media that highlight. Did you know social media algorithms are like finely tuned to make you angry and upset because you stay on the platform longer when you read stuff like that or watch videos like that? So you're far more likely to run into something upsetting online than you are to smell some good fruit. Right? It's there, but it's often overpowered by the bad smell of rotten fruit. And so if we're supposed to understand what the good fruit is in our world, and we're supposed to become God to other people, because that's the fruit of the Spirit, for Christians, then we should be an accurate reflection of God and His love to everybody else that we interact with and that's around us. And so we got to understand how we were supposed to do this. We were supposed to emulate the fruit of the Spirit. God's fruit. And we know this because all the way back in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, it says this: so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. So we're meant to live the good life and be the fruit of God to those around us. And oftentimes we miss that because of the overpowering odor of the rotten fruit in the room. So I get it. It's easy to live in that, but it's no way to live. How many of you have been around people who are just constant pessimists that can find anything to complain about, even if it's the perfect day, they'll find something wrong? Like, are those people fun to be around? Right? It's not, because they suck all the air out of the room. They're no fun to be around, and the smell is rotten. But who would want to live that way? It's tiring to be pessimistic, judgmental, and constantly being focused on all the bad that's around us. It's exhausting because it's everywhere, but it's exhausting because if all our mental space is going to all the negative, then we can overlook what God is actually doing. And so, as Christians, we have a job to go the extra mile and to look for where God is actually moving and start experiencing the good life by seeing the good not only in other people, but in ourselves. Now, the past 4 weeks of this message, we've really been focusing on how you can display the fruits of the Spirit, or how you can better produce the fruit of the Spirit in your own life. But really today, the focus is going to be on others. How do we call out the good in those around us? See, Paul wrote the book of Galatians. There's a letter to the church in Galatia that we've been reading out of that has the fruit of the Spirit. But he also wrote a letter to the church in Rome where he mentions the Spirit in kind of a different way, but the same way. And he goes to say that if we want to fully experience God's presence and have the fruit of the Spirit, we have to follow the Spirit. And the Spirit is power, presence, and work of God that guides us into a truly good life. So this is what he writes in Romans chapter 8. He says, those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. Right? Let me read that part again. Those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires. So the flesh that he's referring to is basically just our own sinful nature. If we don't try to better ourselves, our own nature is selfish, right? Our own what we want comes before what anybody else wants, because that's what sin does. It distorts what's good, and when we only focus on ourselves, that's the flesh he's referring to. It's the less than ideal way of doing things. The flesh is the part of us, get this, that settles for doing things that are satisfying in the short term, even if they are less than what God says is best in the long run. The flesh is the part of us that settles for doing things that are satisfying in the short term, even if they are less than what God says is best in the long term. That's what it means to live in the flesh. We settle. We go for what's immediately present in front of us at the expense of something greater later. And we're so bad at this now because we have things like smartphones. And so this idea of delayed gratification is like so beyond us. It's something that your generation and my generation in particular have to work extra hard to overcome, to be okay being uncomfortable for a while in the short term in order for a greater goal in the long term. Anybody that's ever tried a workout program or had a personal trainer or has been involved in a sport where you have to run a lot, you know this is true because your coach is pushing you, because it may be painful now, but you got to push through it in order to get in shape so that you're better in the long run. And the same is true in every aspect of our life. But Paul says that if we're going with the flow of our flesh, our minds will be focused on things of the flesh. Or in other words, if we live just like the world around us, we'll think just like the world around us. And most of the world around us is obsessed with the upsetting, is obsessed with the fear-mongering, is obsessed with everything that's wrong with the world, right? We live in a great country with more freedom than anywhere else in the world, but yet the overwhelming message that we hear in the news is that America is a terrible place. And the reality is, if we focus on the negative, that's what we'll think about. But living according to the Spirit doesn't stay there. Focusing and living your life in the Spirit doesn't mean you can't acknowledge that there are bad things, but it means that you are focused on a greater good. If we live by the Spirit, we'll begin to see things differently because he shifts our perspective. If you set your mind on things of the Spirit, you're more likely to see the Spirit at work in and around you. If we focus, as Paul says, on what the Spirit desires, we focus on heavenly things, some translations say. If we focus on those things, we're more likely to see God at work. But most of us miss what God is doing around us because we're so caught up in the rotten smell. We're so caught up in the bad fruit. We're so caught up in seeing everything that's wrong that we miss what God is doing right here. And so I'd encourage you guys this week to open your eyes to see where God is moving in your life and around you. When you search for things like joy, like love, like peace, when you search for those things, you're more likely to see where God is at work because those are the fruit of God. That's what it means, the fruit of the Spirit. So if we see those things, we focus and train ourselves on looking at those things, you begin to see God in them because God and His Spirit are the source of all those good things. You begin to see how God is doing great things in an even dark world. You begin to see how God is working even in the lives of imperfect people. I know that's a tough one, especially for me who grew up thinking in a lot of black and white and a lot of it's either this or that, living in the extremes. And so this was difficult for me growing up and even still at times. But God sometimes does His best work through imperfect people. You look all throughout the Old Testament, you see people like Noah, you see people like Adam, people like Moses, people like Abraham. If you read the full accounts in Genesis and Exodus and even go on to the prophets, King David, who conquered Goliath, who conquered the tens of thousands of his enemies, even he fell into the trap of lust and adultery. But God seems to thrive in using us and working through us even in our imperfections. And that's the reckless love of God right there. But we will miss it if we're so focused on the rotten smell in the room. The Spirit helps you see the good in life. And so when we're tempted to despair, when we're tempted to give in to fear, when we're tempted to think that there is nothing good that can come out of a situation, the Spirit is there to move in us, to convict us, to open our eyes to see the way that God sees our world, our situation, our relationships. And if we're so caught up in our own mess, if we're so caught up in the rotten smell, we won't be able to see beyond the fog of that to see what God is truly trying to do and what He is pulling you to be a part of. The reality is when you smell something rotten, that is your opportunity and your calling to go and be the good fruit in that situation. And that's really tough to do. But as we live life through the Spirit, it starts to help us see the good in life, even when it seems dark. Now, some of you, you're not struggling with this at all. You've never had any mental health issues. You've never had any concerns where you're an optimist. You see the good in things, right? And that's great. Okay. A lot of us, we tend to focus on the rotten smell far too often than we care to admit. And it's time for that to stop. Imagine, have you guys ever played any of those apps that have AR, augmented reality, like Pokemon Go is an example. Right, you pull out your phone, you turn your camera on, and suddenly there's things you're seeing in augmented reality that's not actually there, right? The difference, and don't break down the analogy too much or it won't make sense, but just stay with me here. If we view life through the lens of the Spirit, we will see things that we would otherwise think are not there. We will miss what God is doing unless we put the filter of the Spirit on over our eyes. We have to choose to go out of our way around that smell to look for the good fruit. And so I'd encourage you guys to make that a practice. We begin to experience the good life because we begin to see how good life really is. Now, I get it. Some of you come from pretty messed up situations. Some of you come from situations that no one should ever have to go through. Some of you have been through things and are going through things that you never imagined you would have to in this life. But life is still good, and it's still a gift from God. And if you're having a hard time seeing that, I don't blame you. I mean, I grew up in church. I grew up with a Christian family. I grew up with a dad as a pastor. I've gone through my tough seasons. I've been through dark times. And I know from personal experience that in those dark moments, it's almost impossible to see even the smallest sliver of light. But I'd encourage you, don't hide. Because the temptation is going to be to hide in your despair, to hide in your doubts, to imagine that there is no light in the world that could ever overcome the darkness you're facing. And I encourage you to open up about it. Even if that's how you feel, speak it. Talk about it. Because as soon as it's out there, it no longer has control over you. And you can start to begin the healing process, which is a process. But you'll never begin if you hold that inside and you allow the darkness to overcome. We begin to experience the good life because we begin to see how good life really is through the Spirit. So I want you to try looking for God this week. I want you to practice 4 things, okay? Now, there's more than 4 things that you can do to look for God, but I want you to think about these 4 things in particular as a starting point, okay? First of all, you have to hear. You have to hear where God is. You have to hear his heart. In order to do that, we have to go back to the word that he's already revealed to us in the Bible. We have to go back and see what his heart is really like. And if you haven't read much of your Bible, I encourage you to start with John. Because John gives a really great picture of who Jesus is. It starts with the beginning, where there was nothing except the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that Word is referring to Jesus. And then he became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us and left the comforts of heaven to be with us and to encounter us. See, Christianity is the only religion in which God intervenes on our behalf. In all other religions, there's some penance you have to pay. There's something you have to do. You have to earn God. And maybe even then you won't get his attention, but at least you won't go to hell. Christianity is the only belief system that centers around a God that intervenes in our behalf and enters into our situations willingly. That is a God worthy of worship. So hear his heart. Hear what he has said. Hear what he has to say about you. Spend time in his word. Secondly, talk. If you want to become more aware of the good fruit of the Spirit that is in your life and around your life, you have to talk and call it out when you see it. It's funny. There's something psychological about when you verbalize something, it becomes more concrete in your own belief system. Right? This is part of why we sing worship songs, by the way, is because as you verbally sing something or say something, it comes out of your lips, your brain believes it more. That's why when somebody has told a story or told a lie, it could be a truth, but a lot of times this happens with people who lie. This is how they become good liars, because they become so believable. They start to believe their own lies because they've said it so many times. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like, the same is true in the opposite direction. Speak the good when you see it. And before long, your brain will start training itself to see the good things before the bad. So talk. Open up. Call out where you see God moving in and around you. And thirdly is live. Once you begin hearing from God and you begin to talk about where you see him moving, it will start to transform not only your mind, but your feet and your hands and your heart. And it'll start to move you in a different direction where you start to actually live differently and produce that fruit that you start to see in everybody else. One of the best ways that I feel like I've grown in my faith is by spending time with people that I respected, that I admired, that were good role models, and that I saw living out their faith in such a radical way that I wish I could do. And by walking in their footsteps, it's kind of like Paul says in 1 Corinthians. He says, follow me as I have also followed Christ. As we follow those who are following Christ, we start to live that out more. So hear God. Talk about where you see him moving, and then start to emulate that in your own life. And fourthly, last thing, is pray. It seems so simple, but it's so important. Prayer is not only to try to change God's mind. So many of us look at prayer as a way to change God's mind into our favor. Prayer, more than anything else, transforms your mind. It allows us to see things through God's eyes. It shapes our perspective because we invite the Spirit in when we start the conversation with him. That's why it's so hard to be angry with somebody that you're actively praying for. You think about the jerk, the most jerky person you know, the person that you think you could never get along with, the person that has probably hurt you more than anybody else in this life, okay? I promise you this. You can try it for the next month, and I promise you I will change your mind, okay? Pray for that person that you despise the most every single day for 5 minutes straight, and at the end of the month, it would be really hard to hate that person as much as you do now. Because when you pray for somebody, you start to put on the eyes of God. You start to put on the Spirit, and you start to see them as a broken person just in need of the Savior as you. You start to see them, and you may not like them. You may not come to just want to be their bestie. You may not even change your opinion of them, but it will change your perspective on them. And you'll start to see them through God's eyes. It's really hard to be angry at somebody you're actively praying for. So pray, because that will not only transform you, but it will begin to transform your life, the lives around you, because your relationships will get better, because you start to see people the way God sees people. So spend time hearing God's word. Talk about where you see the Spirit moving in the lives around you. Start to live in it. And lastly, pray. Pray for God to transform you. Pray for God to transform the world around you. There's been so many examples all throughout history, through Scripture, through not even Scripture, but just in the history of the world, where you see that Christians, when they pray and they get together to do something, they change the world. The church has been one of the most influential things in the entire world. If you dig into that, you'll see what I'm talking about. So remember, the Spirit helps you to see the good in life. My encouragement to you is to see the good. See the good and look for the good despite the rotten smell. I love, and this is the last time I'll reference John in this message, and I'll wrap this up. But John talks about how Jesus says, fear not, don't be afraid, don't despair, for I have already overcome the world. And the reality is the darkness has not overcome the light. It has not understood it. It has not comprehended the greatness and the goodness of God. Even in the darkest room, the smallest spark of light can illuminate an entire space. So look for, lean into, and follow the light.